All right. We are dealing with students. We have all been there. Each and every time we are asked to address on a paper or on your heads of arguments or in your moot courts while you're busy preparing for your moot courts, you actually wanted your paper in front of you. I know that I'm taking them out of their element and they want to have their script before them, but I'm saying in 2 minutes, they can broadly tell us exactly on what they wrote their papers on. I'll hand them over to you now. Please, go.
Okay. Good morning to everybody. My name is Katliso Mongwe. I am a student of the University of South Africa. I am also a member of the UNISA Law Students Association, and yes, I am part of the executive. Basically, what our paper was, or our assignment was, whether land expropriation could be, the land expropriation could continue without amending Section 25. And basically, the points that I had stated in my paper and the facts that I was expanding on was that in order for land expropriation to continue without a compensation, it is impossible for it to do so without amending the Constitution, because the Constitution provides that we should remunerate the people. And basically the context that I took it from was that how can we remunerate something that was technically done in an illegal manner? It would send a wrong message to say that we are rewarding things that are taken unlawfully and things that were forcefully taken from us. And those were the points that I explored. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had that. In the next one, please. Introduce yourself and what paper you got on.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Mabala, and my perception based on equality clause in conjunction with Section 25 is that before we even look at the land redistribution, we have to also apply Section 8 of equality, the equality clause, I mean. So on my part, I was arguing that we cannot say that we have equality without looking at the land redistribution. So basically what I mean is that before we look at Section 25, we should also look at Section 25 in conjunction with the equality clause, whether to say that is the land, if we say that land is not equally distributed, it means that on that particular clause of Section 25, there is inequality on it. So my point is that before we look at land redistribution, we should also look at whether is the equality clause being applied effectively. Thank you.
Morning. My name is Kesel Sambo from UNISA Polokwane, and I'm also the interim chairperson of the student chapter that side. When we were given the task to write an essay on the land expropriation, it came at the right time, considering the contentions and fights around that topic. So what I looked at the issue of colonization, how it affected us, and who are the rightful who benefited from from colonization, and who are the rightful people that we should give this land back to, and the cost to the government in terms of the procedures, the system that they're going to give land back to the ones who have been disadvantaged. So I also looked at the disadvantage of giving away land to just anyone. We look at the informal settlements. Are we saying that when we're giving land back, Because if we just give land back, we're going to increase informal settlements in South Africa. So I also looked at that part. And I also suggested that if we are going to go for land expropriation, it should be properly developed, and we should look at the administration of this land. Because it's not an issue of saying we can't give back the land, but it's an issue of administration. Now, if we are going to give land back, we should have a proper administration, make sure that corruption does not worm itself into that procedure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Comrades, it is inspiring that the students that we have today at universities, and more especially on these ones that we have called today, to present a paper without actually prescribing to them on what that paper should be based on. The ideas that you just heard, the approach, considerations, and warnings that have been given out by them leads one to believe that the future of this country and Africa as a continent and as a people is indeed bright. The future of the continent lies in its youth. And we are thankful that indeed we have a caliber of this kind of students, youth, leaders of tomorrow that will be heading this country into a new millennium. Thank you very much, guys. The papers that have been written have been handed over to the judges to be marked. And later on tonight, we're going to have a session where presentation will take place. Awards will be issued on the best paper, second best paper, third best paper, and it will be awarded as such. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Now, we are already running a little bit behind schedule, comrades. I'm awaiting the list of our guests that are already in the holding room. As our members are already making their way in. In the meantime,
yes, Mr. President.
Yes. Comrade SG, can I have a word with you, please? Just one word. Our guests are already working in. As I've indicated that indeed it will be ushered to the middle seat here. Comrade President, the middle row, please, for all our guests. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you very much, comrades. Welcome. I see that Comrade Jaji, our former SG, who is now a judge, has just walked in. Welcome, Comrade Judge. Now let me take this opportunity to welcome all our guests. I will go in the following order. Welcome, Mr. Floyd Shimambu, Member of Parliament, Deputy President of Economic Freedom Fighters. I welcome our comrade Malindi SC, amongst our midst. I welcome Comrade Solly Mapaila as well, Mr. Anthony Miller, Mr. Tony Beamish, Mr. Mahlatsi from AWF, Mr. Asif Isa, Comrade President of NADEL, Comrade Mvuso Nochezi, all our distinguished guests, I don't have your names here, you're welcomed as well. Our international dignitaries as well that are here. I welcome you all, comrades. Our sister partners of BLA, you're also welcome. I don't see the president who was here yesterday, but indeed, if they are members of BLA amongst our midst, also from other progressive organizations, you are well welcomed. Thank you. We are now going to start our session and introduce a panelist of members that are going to be dealing with what this conference has been dealing with. This session will look, in terms of our program, at the land issue in the following terms. Land redress must seek to restore human dignity, equality, and economic imbalances. For this, I'm going to introduce the panel that will be taking place, and as I do so, I'll indeed ask them to come up to the podium before we hand over to each of them to address us. The land issue, comrades, has been and will continue to besiege us as a society, as the citizen of this country for many moons to come. NADEL made its input through the leadership of Comrade Malindi SC to Parliament, accompanied by other comrades from NADEL. And indeed, those recommendations, submissions were well received by Parliament, to the extent that, as the president of this organization proclaimed yesterday, that indeed some members of Parliament were very ecstatic with the role that NADEL played on the land issue. Without much ado on this issue, before I call on the panelists to come here, or rather let me do that, I call on Honorable Floyd Shibambu, as I said, Deputy President of the EFF, please to ascend to the podium, who will also be addressing us on the issue. Mr. Solly Mapaila as well. Our own comrade Malindi SC, please. Comrade Floyd. Sit here first. You go first. Okay, yeah, just sit there, please. Now, yesterday we had a panel that was composed of our comrade Nakukanya and Comrade Professor Toli Madonsela. Because the issues that they spoke on, they addressed this conference on, are not divorced from what the panelists are going to be dealing with. Cannot extrapolate only one issue out of the land issue because goes beyond just the land. It also seeks to address many other societal issues. Before I hand over to the panel, I just want to read this quote from Lord Macmillan address to British Parliament on the 2nd of February, 1835. And it reads as follows. I have traveled across the length and breadth of Africa, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old ancient education system, her culture, for if the Africans think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. Close quote. Comrade Floyd Chibambu. Land redress must seek to restore human dignity, equality, and economic imbalances. I hand over to you.
No, thank you very much, Deputy President. Acknowledge the President of NADEL and the entire executive leadership and all the delegates to this AGM. I'm thinking that we should have easily said that the discussion is about the land today. We don't have to put a long topic. We just have to say we're going to talk about the land. I also acknowledge the members from the judiciary that are here. So I'm going to speak broadly to give context to the current discourse on the land question in South Africa. Because at the forefront of a proper conceptualization and understanding of the land question is the economic freedom fighters. So a correct reading of the recent past history is that in 2015, a year after we were in Parliament, we put a motion in the National Assembly to propose that there must be a process of expropriation of land without compensation. And majority of ANC members of Parliament rejected our motion with contempt, and they said that the EFF wants to destroy South Africa, wants to take it into Zimbabwe. And then 2016 local government elections happened. And when the ANC began to lose its electoral support, it went to its 54th National Conference, took a same resolution as the EFF on expropriation of land without compensation. And again in 2018 February, we put a motion in Parliament to say, let us expropriate land without compensation. And it was then that the National Assembly adopted a resolution on expropriation of land without compensation. And because of the EFF, and then of course we then engaged in the process of the Constitutional Review Committee, where we went to different parts of South Africa and we received oral submissions in Parliament. And the Deputy President of NADEL is correct that part of the commendable submissions was a submission from NADEL, also from the Black Lawyers Association, and from NAFU. And maybe the correct thing to say that it is the EFF that understood NADEL's submission and appreciated that we issued a public statement to say that we welcome the submission by NADEL, and even wrote to the leadership of NADEL to say that outside of the submission that you have made, let us further engage to now deal with the process of constitutional amendment. Let us get submissions on the concrete terms, not on the politics, in the legal terms of what phrasing should we use in the Constitution. And then we're committed that there must be that engagement. I thought that we perhaps should give that recent past history so that we understand why this issue is discursive now in terms of the South African discourse. Now, there is massive fictional opposition to the land question from those that control the media in South Africa, like mostly the white minority. They're heavily opposed to the discourse on the land question. So in everything else that happens, like, we have had so many submissions. So in the public hearings, in communities, there was not even one white person who said that we should expropriate land without compensation for equal redistribution. And all the people that came to Parliament who opposed the expropriation of land without compensation, it's either they were white or they were accompanied by a white person. That was the feature, like it was consistent like that. To say that outside of it being a discourse on the fact that we should commonly own the land, there's a national question aspect that we should pay attention to. And why are white people or the white minority opposed to expropriation of land without compensation for equal redistribution? It's because when you are so accustomed to privilege, equality will feel like an oppression. So someone said that when you are so used to white privilege, a demand for equality to you will sound like a demand for oppression of the rights that you have. Now let us just draw a picture in terms of where we are in South Africa. We know the basic facts that South Africa's land size is 122 million hectares. That is 1.2 million square kilometers. So under apartheid, the areas that were demarcated as Bantustans constituted about 16 million hectares, with the Transkei having 5.5 million hectares, followed by the Botswana Bantustan with about 3.9 million hectares, followed by KwaZulu with 3.9 million hectares, followed by Lebowa with about 2.2 million hectares. And those were the so-called self-governing black areas under apartheid. All of them constituted 16 million hectares. So the 13% which we talk about, which you said was under the control of, was the so-called control of black people, were mostly those Bantustan areas in terms of what happened. Now, post-1994, of course, South Africa is still the same size as it was before. Maybe it will geographically expand in the future. But now, it is still the 122 million hectares. And the state is in ownership of largely what were Bantu stands before. Like, so when they say that there is land in the ownership and control of the state, you have about 17 million hectares. So it's just 1 hectare. So the whole 25 years is given 17 million hectares, which is in the control of the state. I want to break that down in terms of who is the state. So the state will include the subnational state in the municipalities, the provinces, and various government departments. It also includes the Sun Parks, the South African National Parks, which owns about 4 million hectares of land, like Kruger National Park and the other parks in the Agalhas and the Table Bay and a variety of other areas that are under the control of the state. But it's proven now that 79% of South Africa's land is owned by private individuals, majority of whom are white people. There's been an attempt by the post-1994 government to redistribute the land. You will know that the World Bank in 1994 had said to the ANC government that at least commit to a redistribution of 30% of the land by 1999. That was the first target. And in 1999, there was dismal failure in terms of that target. And then the goalposts were shifted to 2014, that at least by 2014, actually first it was 2004, later on shifted to 2014, that by 2014, at least 30% of the land should have been bought and given back to the people. But that did not work. Like the piece by piece redistribution of land dismally failed. So an attempt to say, I'm going to take this farm and for redistribution or for restitution purposes, we pay billions of rands like we did with the Malamala in Mpumalanga, and then give to a group of people has dismally failed for a variety of reasons that we'll explain later on. Now, to properly contextualize the EFF's position is to understand these states-owned land now. So part of the land is owned by Sun Park, of course. Some of the land is owned by the Department of Public Works. Some of the land is owned by the Department of Trade and Industry. The land which is owned by Public Works is leased out to private users on lease, sometimes of 30 years, sometimes of 50 years, sometimes of 99 years. There is activity happening in the land which is owned by the state, business activities, investments that happen there. Some of the land is owned by the Department of Trade and Industry. Which land is that? So all the special economic zones in South Africa are owned, the land is owned 100% by the South African state. And that includes Kucha, the East London Development Zone, Atlantis, this OR Tambo Special Economic Zone as well. All that land is owned by the state. And that illustrates a simple thing, that the biggest amount of foreign direct investments in South Africa happens in state-owned land. But every time we say that the state must be in ownership and custodianship of the land, some uneducated racists will say that that is going to chase away investments. It doesn't make sense, because the biggest forms of investments quantitatively happens on state-owned land. You can do that verification by yourselves. And a bigger portion of the forestry land is owned by the Department of Agriculture and Forestries, Fisheries and Forestries, DAF. And it's leased out to the forestry companies, MTO and the rest of them that are playing a role there on a lease basis. They utilize it for forestry purposes. So you have some partial model where the state is custodian of the land and is being used productively in South Africa. What then becomes the EFF's position? The EFF's position, which is actually contained in the resolution that was taken in February 2018 in Parliament, says that the Constitutional Review Committee should go and make public consultations and talk to the people about, one, the expropriation of land without compensation, and two, the land custodianship by the South African government. That is what it says, and that has been somehow subdued because the major focus was on the expropriation component. But it also speaks about how then do we deal with land tenure, post-expropriation of land without compensation. Now that is the position of the EFF to say that let us, number one, amend Section 25 of the Constitution to permit for expropriation of land without compensation. And let us mention in the Constitution that the people of South Africa are going to be in ownership of all South Africa's land. And the state, a democratically elected government, will be the custodian of all the land. And the mechanism of redistribution and land user rights will be granted case by case and circumstance by circumstance. So if the Department of Trade and Industry has to avail land for industrial purposes, it should have that function under certain conditions. Where municipalities must play a role, there must be clear contours of what role should municipalities play in the allocation of residential land and land for other purposes. Where public works has to play a role, it must be clear in terms of what should happen. Where traditional leaders must play a role, there must be clarity in terms of what role should traditional leaders play. We met with, for instance, Contralesa, which represent a significant number of traditional leaders in South Africa, and said, we do not have a problem as the EFF with traditional leaders playing a role in the redistribution and allocation of land, but only on the basis that it must not be sexist. It must not discriminate people on the basis of gender. And two, it must not be nepotistic, because it must not just be given to relatives and close friends of whoever is a traditional leader. And then we also said that the traditional leadership should not give the same piece of land to several people to avoid conflict, so that there is some degree of land redistribution process at a traditional leadership level. But the fact that we say custodianship is because we know that an attempt to distribute land or to buy land piece by piece will not succeed. Let's work on simple numbers. I saw some organization called Africa Check disputes the fact that the state bought about 7% of the land from 1994 until now. Let's say it's 10%. So it takes you 25 years to redistribute 10% of the land. What that means is that in 50 years you would have redistributed 20% in 50 years. So 40% can only happen in 100 years. It cannot take that long, because land ownership defines access to economic opportunities, to economic freedom in a manner in which we conceptualize it. So a lot of our people will still be subjugated to white minority rule and oppression economically if we do not deal decisively with the land question. You know that the 5th Parliament is going to rise, is going to close before we amend the Constitution. Because the ANC is not committed to amending the Constitution. It's not sure. There's no clarity of what is the position of the Congress movement in its entirety in terms of this question. They do not know, in many instances, what are the basic facts on the ground. For instance, there's an issue which we should deal with. There's an issue about Ingonyama Trust. So that 3.9 million hectares of land under the KwaZulu government, Bantustan. So Mangosuthu Buthelezi and IFP negotiated in the CODESA process until very late, just before elections, to transfer all that land into Ngonyama Trust. And that was through passing of a legislation which was signed by F.W. de Klerk on the 25th of April 1994, 2 days before elections, the Ngonyama Trust Act. So all the land that is under Ngonyama Trust is the land that is owned by the state now, but it is administered by Ngonyama Trust. So what happens there is that traditional leaders and the council around King Goodwill Zwelithini, they set the laws in terms of how that land is allocated. And in many instances, it discriminates against women. In many instances, a lot of people, including poor people, are forced to pay rental for that land which they are occupying there. And that is one of the things that courageously we must say should come to an end when we have a different land redistribution regime. And all of these things should guarantee security of tenure, because I know many people are concerned that if you say that the state is going to redistribute the land, politicians are not sometimes dependable. They can give you land and then they only to come and take it back later on. We should put in place proper legislative mechanisms and protection to guarantee security of tenure, particularly of residential land and land that is utilized for different purposes. But also with the principle that if you have been given agricultural land or industrial land and you do not use it, you should lose it. That is the principle that we should deal with. And economically, the state's ownership and custodianship of the land can be utilized as as an incentive to potential investors, because a lot of people who would want to invest in areas that are not demarcated as special economic zones have to buy the land. The state which wants to build a university in Mpumalanga, in the Northern Cape, and expand some of the campuses have to buy the lands for unreasonable rates. So the private ownership of land in the manner in which it's configured in South Africa now is undermining development, is undermining potential economic growth. So that is basically the perspective that we are putting as the economic freedom fighters. And we can assure you that it is going to be resolved in the manner in which we are saying. So the EFF position is going to be government's position, is going to be South African Parliament position. That is a fact. Because after the 8th of May, the EFF will be qualitatively and quantitatively stronger than it is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Floyd Shabambu. Of course, the last portion of your speech was a passing shot. And I don't know whether the empty seats that you see there at the back that are in red meant anything to you, but thank you very much, Mr. Floyd Shabambu. Of course, you have given this House food for thought. There's still going to be a lot of reflection on this issue. It is not the done deal as yet. Allow me to take this moment to welcome also amongst us Judge Vincent Saldanha. I'm informed that he's here. Judge Papir, Judge Roshin Ali is here. Judge Mokoha is here. Once again, those members of the judiciary that have not been given their names that are here, we also welcome. Our former SG, I don't know where he is. He would also want me to include him on the list of judges that I'm welcomed. So, Comrade Judge Jaji, where are you? Okay, thank you. Yesterday, of course, we had the Judge President of the SCA, Judge Moya, and Constitutional Court Judge and Acting Judge Lidwaba in the Constitutional Court that were here as well. So, those members of the judiciary that are here today, you're also welcomed. We recognize you. I'm going to bring up now the second panelist on this issue. I'm going to bring up Comrade Solly Mapaila, who is the first Deputy General Secretary of the SACP. Now, he's wearing a red shirt as well. I suppose with a rider on it right above his left upper chest. It's rather a bit confusing, Comrade Solly Mapaila, wouldn't you say? Comrade Shivambu is wearing a red beret. You're wearing a red shirt. Comrade Solly Mapaila, up to you.
Amandla, Matla, all power. Viva NADEL, viva! Viva ANC, viva!
Viva.
No. My apologies for jumping into that space quite early. I have come from a perspective that NADEL has been a congruent component of the mass democratic forces that supported the national liberation struggle, primarily headed by the ANC. So, strategically and objectively, there will be necessarily nothing different between the interests and objectives of NADEL and that of the ANC. Comrade Deputy President, thank you very much for the opportunity to share our perspectives and to share our ideas, particularly regarding the land question. Let me greet first the leadership of NADEL, Comrade President, the Deputy President, all the office bearers, various delegates from all sections of our province, of our country, the jurists who are here, and of course our former General Secretary, who's a judge, was a militant. In fact, we were much closer with NADEL during his term. We must rectify this matter, Comrade President. My dear panelists, Advocate Malindi, and I must say, because I may not get this podium, Comrade Deputy President, that Advocate Malindi had supported us legally on the matter of Comrade Krisani for many years, and many a times in your language, pro bono. Sometimes when we are unable to pay, even basic running costs, you look the other way and smile nicely, and on the day of court is our SC. So we always go to him, no matter what are the challenges, and he never let us down. We want to thank him especially, and to thank NADEL for cloning him, and that he continues to express your perspectives in public. Comrade Floyd, Shibambo, and I knew he thought I would not say this, but I will say it. I gave him his first job at the party headquarters. So he worked for us. So there's no animosity whatsoever between us, Comrade Deputy President. The colors complement each other. I can tell you, without taking my time, that in terms of our perspectives on ideology, the communist philosophy, and I heard by rumors and gossip that someone here had indicated that they were once a communist. Now, I'll just give an analogy expressed by Obabu Elias Mtswaledi regarding this question. He once said, communist, I'm translating that into English. He said it in Sepedi, but in English it will go like this. Communists are true witches, that they can cast you with their spell of ideology. And once they've cast you with this spell, it doesn't leave you. You die with it, or you betray it. So we can grasp, we use the word grasp in our language. You can't grasp the communist ideology, its way of doing things, of thinking, and think one day you are no longer communist. It's impossible. So it's lack of understanding of the communist ideology, particularly its philosophical basis, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and so forth. So Comrade Floyd, even when he's in the EFF, whether the EFF can deviate to some other ideology of some sort, he will, in his mentality, remain a communist as we trained him. What it means is that any analysis that he comes across, he does, it will be within the framework of this thinking. It will be his decision to betray that thinking or not. Coming to the content, Comrade Deputy President, we want to first indicate that there's too much in common, and I think there's general agreement in our society that the land crisis should be resolved. The context, of course, goes back to the period of the arrival of the colonists in South Africa, the capturing of the Cape, 1652, by Jan van Riebeeck and his team. Later on, the war in the country, the Anglo-Boer War, and after its conclusion, towards the treaty, the peace treaty of Vereeniging, the decision to establish the Union of South Africa. And in the establishment of the Union, in 1910, the new South Africa, or the Union of South Africa, aggressively excluded the majority of the population, of the indigenous people, from decision-making. In this regard, laws were enacted, including the Native Land Act of 1913, Act 27, which restricted black Africans to a mere 13% of the ownership of land, of largely barren pieces of our very beautiful and fertile land. Comrade Floyd gave detailed information about what subsequently happened with those pieces of land, who they were allocated to. They further, in 1927, through Act 38 of 1937, proclaimed the Black Administration Act, which gave the Governor General of the time exclusive powers to give land and to take land, including to give land to traditional leaders. And in many instances, this Governor General will remove traditional leaders in the land that they were owning, replace them with people who were not even of royal blood. Basically, arbitrarily used the land to try and coerce the traditional leaders into the systemic oppressive system of the colonists. And of course, later on, the enactment of apartheid, with the National Party coming to power in 1948, which further created deeper problems regarding the land question. And of course, you'll know, immediately the apartheid government came into power, their first and main target was to remove the Communist Party. They enacted the Suppression of Communism Act. 1950 April, they passed this act, basically banning communism, because they saw it as a threat. And of course, at that time, the Communist Party was already the non-racial organization in the country, and they couldn't accept non-racialism because the policy of apartheid, of segregation, could not be consonant with an organization that was already non-racial. But it's important to say, given that this is not a main speech, but a panel, just to highlight key questions regarding the foundations of the land question. We see the land primarily as a platform to resolve property relations in society. That's our first approach to the land question as the SACP, to resolve property relations. Property relations are inherently linked with production relations, and therefore distribution relations as well as consumption relations. In other words, the organization of society, of human society, is largely based on production, which is economic, for human beings to eat, to live. And that platform of production is the basis of inequality and exploitation of human beings historically. That is why you can't restore dignity of people, coming to the theme of this conference, Comrade Deputy President. You can't restore dignity of the people and redress, particularly imbalances of the past, without necessarily fundamentally resolving the system that creates those inequalities, which is the system of capitalism. And therefore, the system of capitalism, its foundation, it's on production. And when we have taken the primary tool of production, which is the land, those who scavenge to use the land will invariably become permanent slaves on the land in the field of production. And therefore, that's where we come from fundamentally. So there can be an illusion sometimes within the bourgeois liberal capitalist democracies to think that because we have created a platform for engagement, we will end exploitation of the people, will transfer lands, this and that, and once that is done, all will be honky-dory, everyone will be okay in society. It can't work like that. You have to resolve the fundamental crisis and problem of modern human society, the system of capitalism. Now, intellectually, you can go anywhere. There's no way in which you can resolve this question without resolving the system of capitalism. So fundamentally, Comrade Floyd, going forward, as we build a broad front of socialists, we have to come and resolve this question once we have passed this law on the land expropriation without compensation in Parliament. But I must also say, In 2003, the Communist Party launched a campaign called Mawubuye Umhlaba. That was the title of our campaign, Mawubuye Umhlaba. What it means is that bring back the land. We launched that 2003. Big marches that we had across the country. 60,000 people came up in Lichtenberg. About 40,000 people came up in Pretoria, in Tshwane. We went to Agri-SA. One Andile Mkitama, for instance, came with a group of people to disrupt our march. Today is a champion of land transformation and reform. So what I'm trying to say is that whilst political organizations and politicians will want to appropriate the question of the land to themselves, let's not forget history and the realities of mass struggle and campaigns for transformation. Because Parliament is just a mere platform of making laws. The masses must organize themselves into a transformational agenda to make changes possible. Without that, the laws, we've got many good laws, by the way, that are not implemented, largely because of lack of struggles, mass struggles, to make sure that those laws are implemented. And of course, the other key question, Comrade Deputy President, is that if we are to resolve the land question based on this framework of resolving the property question, that is property relations, we must also deal with the colonial property relations, which currently characterize South African society and South African land ownership, which I think Comrade Floyd explained quite clearly. But we must also indicate that these colonial property relations are bourgeois colonial property relations. If you like, they are capitalist property relations. That is the reason why we continue to find this crisis. And on the one hand, the post-colonial South African state further guaranteed property rights, meaning therefore it further guaranteed colonial property relations into the future, subjecting the majority of the people to this inherent form of slavery by this property relation that we sustained. So resolving this question, we must also address fundamentally the reordering of the colonial property relations in South Africa. I agree, Comrade Floyd, that in all respect, the land question is not just about agriculture, because sometimes the debate seems to drive there, that is just about agriculture. We also support agriculture, by the way. That our approach also is about land and agrarian reform. It's not just about ownership of the land. We agree with you broadly, the question about the land use, which must be articulated clearly in the process of these changes that are taking place. But we should also indicate that to address the whole question about the economy, whether, let's say in the urban areas, for instance, where mining, for instance, mining, it's a land economy. It's not just merely an industrial economy. Mining takes place on land and underneath the land in the main. So it's a land economy. It's an economic question in totality. And we really believe that post the question of just about expropriation of land without compensation, we must engage as a country on the debate about land use. We can take examples, for instance, of some of the countries nearby, say, for instance, Zimbabwe, where where the government was delaying the transfer of land. Hitler Hunzi led the war veterans to go and take back the land by force, and they created massive chaos in the transformation of that particular country. Be that as it may, Zimbabwe has now produced no less than 200,000 small-scale farmers who are living entirely on the land. over 200,000. So that means we can use the land productively and create self-sustenance of the people on the land. And that part of the things that we can learn from Zimbabwe has been the failure, for instance, to support those who have taken over the land with implements, for instance. People took land, they didn't know what to do with it. It laid fallow. And which is also part of the problem with our land process here in South Africa, that is the land transformation program, which was characterized by largely 3 elements. Land redistribution, for instance, which deals with the transfer and acquisition of land, particularly for farming and human settlements. The land restitution, which basically sought to give back the land to those whose land was taken through the apartheid government, as well as land tenure. This broad framework, in the main, particularly the section on restitution, I agree with Floyd, has been dismally a spectacular failure. Although the pace of revolution is different, by the way, sometimes it's not necessarily mechanical, but if you look at the years we've taken, listen to what Comrade Floyd was saying, I agree with him completely. Although we can say the pace of the revolution should necessarily be determined by the hindmost. It should be determined by the people in the rural areas who have been excluded, who can make a livelihood out of the land, in the land of plenty. So even the restitution mechanism should not just be about who were removed from this place, who want to go there ancestrally, important as that may be, particularly from an African perspective. But it should also deal with the economic conditions of the people in the most impoverished sections of our society, particularly the rural areas. So these 3 major frameworks that characterize the South African land transformation post-1994 of post-democratic victory, it's critical that it's consolidated and reinvigorated and revitalized so that it can garner pace. Otherwise, you can still pass this law and there's no pace for transformation. So the situation doesn't change, but we have the ownership of land. Lastly, Comrade Chair, for instance, I think just to indicate this point, let me leave it. Comrade Floyd dealt with it. I think the other about the lack of pace in that regard, the number of years that it can take and so forth. The other issue was to address this question of the willing buyer, willing seller. It's been fully addressed in the land expropriation framework, but we must still say, particularly the land that is in the hands of the private sector, the statistics about 79% and so forth, that's a massive land. What are we going to do about it? And also we must deal with this phenomena that people just think that when we pass the expropriation of land without compensation, someone can simply walk into a house the next day and say, no, this is my piece of land, or I want this piece of land. It won't happen like that. It must be an orderly process. That's why in that regard, we also agree with the presentation by NADEL in this regard. Lastly, Comrade Chair, is to indicate that the debate about expropriation of land without compensation must also be a focused debate. What land and which land are we going to expropriate without compensation? Will it be unused land, underutilized land? Why do we expropriate that particular land? Who should it be given to? I agree with the framework, part of the point that Comrade Floyd was raising regarding, for instance, in lending the traditional leaders, which, by the way, we have also met Comrade Floyd. I knew that we met them a week before the EFF met them. And when they met with the EFF, there's a big media thing. We met them in private. There was no media stuff. But we had a good discussion with them because they were even afraid, some of them, to meet the communists because they were meant to believe that communists hate traditional leaders, which is not necessarily the case. And we agree with the framework regarding how to use the land in the rural areas, particularly transform land in the rural areas regarding in the main, what we call the transformation of the rural motive forces, the conditions of women in the rural areas, the addressing of the patriarchal question in the rural areas, which, for instance, when we engage with a Contra Lesa, as one organization in the traditional leadership space, for instance, they indicated their disdain for patriarchy. And we think it's an area that we can work with them to fight that patriarchy in localities. I think it's important to simply say that the land expropriation without compensation, it's a necessity for South Africa. It's long overdue. It should not necessarily be unnecessarily racialized, but it must resolve the racial inequalities in land redistribution. So in other words, South Africans must still be committed to build a non-racial society, even when we address the land question. So we should not allow the land question to divide South Africa into racial hatred. The commitment to resolve racism should remain the strategic focus of our country. The land that we want to distribute is for all South Africans across racial groups. And in this regard, therefore, we want to say at the SACP, we will work with all organizations who are interested in this process. Officially, the main organization that launched a full-scale political campaign on the land question before the EFF was born, Comrade Floyd. And we agree that you must join us in this campaign to continue the struggle. The struggle is long. Amandla! Thank you very much.
Comrades, very strong address from Comrade Solima Paila. Before I call on the podium Comrade Tina Malindi, allow me to recognize and welcome Judge Mbata, who is here with us, member of the judiciary. I also recognize and welcome Judge Ledwaba, who was here with us yesterday, who is here with us today again. Welcome, Judge. Judge Ledwaba is acting judge in the Constitutional Court. I also want to welcome Judge from my Free State Division, where I come from, Judge Chesiwe. I'm informed that she's in the house as well. Welcome, Judge Chesiwe. I also been informed that Advocate Nkosi Thomas is also with us. Welcome, Judge Advocate Nkosi. Where are you? There you go. Thank you. Now, Comrade Kwina Malindi, SC, you had Comrade Shivambu, Comrade Solima Paila. Now you will have to give NADEL response, an update on the land redistribution and resolutions for expropriation of land without compensation. But before you do that, which is maybe one of the issues that comrades, okay, I've just been interrupted. I would also like to recognize and welcome Judge Malusi, who I'm also informed that is present here with us. Welcome, Judge. Thank you, Judge. Now, maybe Comrade Shivambu and Comrade Solima Paila would have somehow touched on the issue of whether, and which is something that Comrade Malindi might have to deal with, whether there can be, which is a serious question, whether there can be a fair process of addressing an unfair process as well. In other words, can you really address an unfair situation with a fair process? How do you do that? Comrade Malindi.
Thank you very much, Comrade Deputy President. Greetings to all the leaders of NADEL at all levels, members of the judiciary, dignitaries and comrades. Before I commence my response to the other two comrades, I would like to play a 2-minute clip that involves someone speaking on the land issue very authoritatively. And I will ask Spesihle to play the clip for us. Well, if it's not happening, we will play it during the course of my speech. Comrade Floyd and Comrade Soli have laid fully the basis, the ideological basis from which NADEL also approached the question of expropriation of land without compensation, or the question of land and property rights when we addressed the Constitutional Review Committee in Parliament. So I will not go there, save to state that the whole debate on the question of land and ownership of property lacks that basis of an ideological approach to the question of land. It lacks that ideological approach from those people who want to agitate for land redistribution and land reform. But for all the people who already own land, own property, and control the economy of the country, there is no doubt that they come from an ideology which they want entrenched forever, and that is capitalist. So Comrade Soli has dealt with that issue, and I will not traverse it further. The question of land expropriation started with, well, didn't start there. It's always been an issue, even as far back as the question of who the land belongs to, and some of the answers are contained in the Freedom Charter. Now, when we intensified the question about the land and expropriation, it was initially clear that there were no limits on the basis on which the state may expropriate land. But very cleverly, the people who control the debate and the dissemination of information on this debate have forced us to talk now about limited basis upon which land may be expropriated. Even the ANC at the moment emphasizes circumstances under which expropriation of land may be permitted. And that is reflected in the draft expropriation bill especially in Chapter 5 thereof. Chapter 5 reads as follows. At least clause 12.3. It may be just and equitable for nil compensation to be paid where land is expropriated in the public interest, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including but not limited to where the land is held purely for speculating purposes. 2, where the owner of the land has abandoned the land. 3, where the market value of the land is equivalent to or less than the value of the direct state investment or subsidy in the acquisition and the beneficial capital improvement of the land. Now, you will see that what Comrade Soli Mapaila was talking about, that the people who conquered land under colonialism and took land even further away from black people by the passing of various pieces of legislation from the 1913 Native Land Act to legislation like the pieces of legislation like Group Areas Act, etc., have now decided to freeze the ownership of land and property in their own hands and want us to limit us to fighting over what remains of what they have already taken. So the question of expropriation of land ownership now denies us the right to say there should be a basis of leveling the playing field, so to speak, on the ownership and use of the land. So unfortunately, the ANC has accepted the narrative, and I usually don't like using the word narrative, but the narrative that expropriation should be limited to only those circumstances that are in part set out in the draft expropriation bill. However, the Joint Committee on Constitutional Review Committee's recommendations read as follows: that Section 25 of the Constitution must be amended to make explicit that which is implicit with regard to expropriation of land without compensation as a legitimate option for land reform, so as to address the historic wrongs caused by the arbitrary dispossession of land, and in so doing ensure equitable access to land and further empower the majority of the South Africans to be productive participants in land ownership, food security, and agricultural reform programs. Now, what is explicit and implicit in the Constitution? Section 25(2) of the Constitution reads, property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application. So what is explicit or implicit in the Constitution is not to limit the question of expropriation to whether the land is vacant, is unused, or any of the other conditions that are now built in the draft expropriation bill. The only conditions in the Constitution are for a public purpose or in the public interest, and then the contentious subject to compensation clauses. Now, when NADEL presented before the committee, we are of the view that the Constitution, in fact, does not permit expropriation without compensation. And I will not go through all of that, and save to criticize the ANC, which has now accepted the analysis of the Constitution by people who are not pro-expropriation of land, who are not pro-ownership of land by the state, who want to continue to own the 87 or 83% of the land to the exclusion of the majority of the people. Now, the Constitution clearly makes it peremptory that compensation must be paid before land may be expropriated. Now, the draft expropriation bill deals with the question of compensation. And it deals, amongst others, with taking into account the factors that are already in the Constitution. But I want to read some of the conditions that are set in the bill, which will make it so difficult to achieve expropriation, even with the conditions that are set out in that bill for purposes of expropriation, of compensation. So, comrades, all we can say as lawyers is that if this draft bill passes as is, or even with amendments and modifications, it is going to be a piece of legislation that all of us lawyers love, because everything in that Constitution will be justiciable. So there is no aspect of the process of expropriation which will not be subject to contestation in courts, etc. The bill believes that it makes things easier by saying the first step will be mediation. It provides for mediating and the question of compensation before determination by a court. All the lawyers who are here will know that through that process of mediation, there will be so many obstacles put in the place of people who can hardly afford to litigate, and by the time they go to court, they'll be forced into compromises that will not achieve the purpose of expropriation and land distribution. Now, as NADEL, we have looked at various forms of land secure or land tenure, forms of land tenure. The starting point of many of the people who debate the question of land and property is that private ownership of land and property is the surest way to ensure that our country develops and prospers. But there are many forms of secure land tenure that are used all over the world, including freehold, which is being agitated for in our country and is in existence. There is leasehold, there is public rental, there is private rental, there is security of tenure for customary, aboriginal and indigenous ownership. There is national or international heritage ownership. So as South Africans, we are failing to explore other forms of land ownership. We want to emphasize freehold as if that is the only form of land tenure that will ensure prosperity. We don't have to look very far because in Mozambique, most of us will know that there is a combination of forms of tenure. There's freehold and there's leasehold. And if we go to other countries that we love so much in Europe, in England, in Switzerland, we know that
leasehold is one of the key forms of land ownership and land use. And we urge as NADEL that starting from the position of principle and ideology, which is that land must belong to the state, but because that is now a sore word to say the state must own land, that land must be placed under the control of a body that is a trust with land distribution. We will be moving at least from a position of principle and ideological purity, as the SACP has indicated. But from then on, we must then deal with the specifics, which we have begun to do so through the bill, and also not be tempted to say that we have not addressed the question of land ownership or land expropriation until we have provided detailed legislation on what happens to people's houses, what happens to property that is under encumberment by mortgages, etc. We must move from a position that, or as a matter of policy, land will be controlled in a manner that will ensure that all these forms of tenure apply in South Africa, not only freehold as we have. Now, in the limited time that we have between us here, I must also conclude by saying that during the days of struggle, we envisage that the question of land will be applied uniformly across all the people of South Africa. And we repeated that in the constitution of our country when we said South Africa belongs to all. And that is a repetition of what the Freedom Charter has already taught us and that we believe in. The process that we have followed since 1994 is regressive. And it is going to lead to not only a racial strife about land ownership, but to tribal and ethnic strife. Because the process of restoring land at the moment restores land on the basis of how apartheid had shaped our society. The king of the Zulu, together with Mangosuthu, emphasized that the Ngwenyama Trust is land that must not be touched. And we panic and we tremble each time they tell us about how they will unleash violence upon us if we dare touch that piece of land. So for us to build a non-racial South Africa, we must ensure that land really belongs to the people and that land is not carved according to ethnic and tribal groupings going forward. Otherwise, if we do that, we are going to find ourselves again being divided along racial, tribal, ethnic lines, and also the way we are doing it by restoring powers to traditional leaders, we are going to have women excluded from the whole question of how land in South Africa is utilized. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the address, Comrade Tina. Comrades, our country is governed by laws underpinned by the Constitution. And when one listens to the panel, one is okay. I'm just being informed that the Comrade Tina, the video that he wanted to play to be aired as part of your presentation is ready to be aired. But before then, let me just conclude this, what I was saying before it is played, that our country is governed by a constitution. As I've heard from and listened to the panelists, all of them keep going back to the constitution. Our constitution guarantees rights, seeks to achieve fairness, and which is why I pose the question that centuries of unfairness are now trying to be undone with a fair process, a policy document, constitution that seeks to achieve fairness. How does one do that? How do you do that? Centuries of unfairness, address it with a fair process. How do you reverse all that? Maybe that's a question for another day. But anyway, thank you very much, Comrade Tina. Thank you very much, Comrade Shivambu, Comrade Soli. Thank you. Before you leave the podium, you're not going to leave the podium as yet. The Deputy Secretary of NADEL is going to coordinate the discussion as soon as I descend from this podium. And before I do that and before I hand over to her, I can ask the video to be played and be aired in the process. Thank you. Sorry, you're not going anywhere.
Questions, right? So I'm going to first ask your attitude view on exploration of the conversation.
In America, they've got a thing called eminent domain, where if it's in the absolute public good, land can be expropriated. It's how it's done. Because the last 10 years has not really been good in terms of state interference. If you look at the fiasco we've had.
In a nutshell, what is your view on land exploration without compensation?
I don't think we'll ever have peace unless there is a proper redistribution. I wouldn't say land, I would say property.
You did admit that
property, and that we grow the economy at such a rate, which is, we're going to have to grow 5% plus.
So before we talk about economy, so am I hearing you say property from a wealth creation and growth and sustainable point of view has got to be addressed in and recognizing the emotive nature of land? And I do understand the distinction between land overall from an emotive point of view, historical significance, restoration of people's dignity perspective, and what you can do with property. So,
well, why do you think I started business partners in 79?
Right.
To give people leases. And why now I'm helping the Free Market Foundation to give people title deeds.
Right. There is a property aspect of story, which is separate from the land part.
People have been living in these homes for decades. I mean, this lady, 102 years old, they bought these places.
I'm not sure, Comrade Tina, it is your video. Is it where it ends? Is that the portion that you wanted to see? Okay, thank you very much. All right, as I indicated, comrades, this is now time for me to descend from the podium. Thank you very much again, the panelists. I'm now going to be handing over to the Deputy Secretary of NADEL to take the session forward. Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. We are now opening the session to the floor and we are taking questions. Can I have hands, please? I'm going to start on the side of the room. Siam 1, Comrade Mongezi 2. Mics, please.
One, two.
We are covered.
All fine.
Comrades, there are lots of questions on the floor. I'm going to start from this end of the room so I don't miss you all. It was Comrade Advocate Maliwa, Comrade Mongezi, and there's 2 hands at the back. We'll start here at the front, please. Can I have the mic for Comrade Maliwa?
I do have a mic, but a second one I would not mind.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary. There are a lot of things I disagree on with Floyd Shivambu, most of which anchor around our preferred political affiliation. But there's one thing perhaps I think today I want to agree with him on. Maybe the greatest mistake we've ever done as a movement, Comrade Soli, which over time we must evaluate, both as participants of young people and as leaders of the Congress movement in general, is how did we let such a brain go away? This anchors on 2 points, and this is a book titled Oliver Tambo Remembered. When Thabo Mbeki is asked to make his own reflection on what kind of president Tambo is, he says he was a difficult person to deal with, but most importantly, what he learned from Tambo was that at times, we must give ourselves adequate opportunity to learn from our opponents, even those we believe are the worst in character. As I said earlier, I'm surely not an affiliate of the Economic Freedom Fighters, but God, do I agree with their approach on how the land must be redistributed without compensation. 3 things, Comrade Floyd, that I want you to take further. Foreign direct investment. I do agree with you that most of what foreign direct investment would encapsulate has participation on the owned land and property that is owned by the state currently. Am I following your debate to be saying, for us to expand on foreign direct investment, we then need to extend the control arm of the state on land that is privately owned? If yes, I agree with you. If no, why are you not saying that? I move from a perspective that the redistribution of land ought to be, in order for us to create maximum foreign direct investment, which is already happening mostly on the land and business forum that is owned by the state. So am I following your discussion correctly? I know you'll capture me. The second thing, you speak of an integrated land plan. And this, I presume, has to do with the outright layout on villages, integrated governmental plan. How do we take municipal officials, how do we take government departments to be active role players into the active network of land redistribution? Fairly, I do think it's an opportunity that NADEL has properly created in the presence of one of our own, Advocate Gcina Malindi, in the presence of judges. Perhaps it's a question of the interpretation of Section 25. This is where I struggle. Section 25, subsection 7 of the Constitution empowers Parliament to create what I call an outroot veto for a favorable condition for the redistribution of land. Is the discussion by Comrade Soli, by the EFF, by NADEL through Comrade Gcina Malindi that Section 25.7, which already has created a document upon where we base our reliance, is inefficiently working, in which case do we amend the Constitution to specifically state that land redistribution without compensation is an option available under the purview of Section 25. Now, it's a discussion that I want particularly Comrade Soli and Comrade Gcina Malindi to go to town about whether the reading of Section 25(7) and the interpretation thereof, is it not really creating what has now given birth to the bill, the draft which we have in Parliament, empowered by Section 25(7)? It might be an improper...
Thank you, Comrade Maliwa. Thank you. I don't want to stop you there, but there are questions across the room that we're going to have to go through, and you're going into a discussion. Can I please ask that each person is given a minute, even less, because we have many questions across the room. I want to, and some questions will be repeated. So I want us to streamline the discussion. Thank you. Yeah. Comrade Mongezi?
Thank you, Comrade Ukest.
Thank you, Comrade Deputy Secretary. My question is a short one. For those who believe that the Constitution as it currently stands permits for expropriation without compensation, is it not then now, as we speak, an opportunity for them to demonstrate that that clause can form a basis for a meaningful economic program that demonstrates in practice and in reality that the objectives of eradicating poverty, the objectives of agrarian reform, the objectives of economic development based on land use can be achieved? I mean, we're not talking about an abstract situation. We're saying the argument must be, if it is logical and correct, that you can expropriate now without compensation and pursue a program of economic emancipation that you want to. Why is it not being done? And why should it not be done now, as we are exploring this long and tenuous process of amending the Constitution, promulgating a bill, going to court? By the time that process is concluded, it will be about 10 years, 5 years. So let us try it now, have a program now, implement it now, and see if it works or it fails. And by the way, I'm not saying Gcina Malindi or the comrades, they are wrong in terms of what they're articulating. Thank you.
I recognized one more person at the back. Comrade, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Comrade Deputy Secretary. My name is Titi Dube from Bombela. I want to agree that the expropriation of land without compensation will give access to the majority of black people to the land. But now, that is perhaps a strategic objective. It will still take us many years to develop those pieces of land that will be expropriated. But at this current juncture, we need a tactical resolution, a tactical solution. How do we disrupt the exclusion of black people from ownership? Just the past week, there was an article, there was, I think, an expose of black people being excluded from property ownership by the banks because of higher rates, interest rates. So I want comrades I want you to give us a solution. How are we going to solve that currently, tactically, as we move towards this strategic objective? Thank you.
Thank you. That's the first round of questions.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. My question...
Mkabela, so I'll come back to you. We're going to take the first 3 questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think let's... I don't understand this question of saying which land must be expropriated. So this is the map. So when we say we must expropriate the land, we refer to this one, the whole of it. That is what we are referring to. It's not a piece by piece, and one of the opportunism that happened was that, and Comrade Soli must be very careful of What is happening there? So the Constitutional Review Committee takes a firm decision that we must amend the Constitution to permit for expropriation without, to permit for expropriation without compensation. And in December, like when Parliament is closed during holidays, the Ministry of Public Works, which is led by the chairperson of the Communist Party and Jeremy Cronin, I don't know what his role is now, publish an expropriation bill which is extremely problematic, reactionary, and it's a sellout position. Purely that, like basically with the, so Advocate Malindi says that it defeats that process that we're dealing with of the Constitution, because it says, no, there must be reason for expropriation of land, you must negotiate piece by piece, try mediation first and everything else. It's going to take us another 100 years. That is the intention. So we take the land and agree on the security of tenure on the current occupants for agricultural purposes, for residential purposes, for industrial purposes, for fisheries purposes, for forestry purposes. And then we then redistribute on need basis. Then the redistribution will become equitable. That is the only way. There is no other way. And then you can even have a land redistribution bill, not expropriation, because the expropriation has been handled there. And then in the land redistribution bill, you then outline who will be responsible for which functions at what level. You can then say that municipalities can play a role in terms of allocation of, they do now, in terms of allocation of residential land, in terms of allocation of other forms of land in areas that they are in charge of. Provinces can play a role as well. National departments can play a role. And we take a deliberate decision as the EFF that we should define a role for traditional leaders, but it must be within a certain context of rules. Of everyone, it must apply to everyone. So the rules that apply to municipalities and everyone else there should apply to how the traditional leaders should redistribute the land. And the reason we take that position is because we do not want to legislatively abolish the legitimate traditional leaders' relationship with the land. Because it's as good as abolishing the institution itself. And it cannot be us who do that. Like, traditional leadership happens everywhere in the world. We can just have to adapt it to the conditions that define us now. That is the context of the whole thing. So the ANC's lack of a clear and coherent position on the land question gives space to opportunists to come with all sorts of different interpretations on what should happen. And then they just depend on the slogan and sloganeering. You know, we're going to support expropriation without compensation, but in essence they don't. The ANC doesn't. So there's just confusion that is being pushed in terms of what should happen. So we say that as part of the incentives to investments, like let us say investments broadly, not just foreign direct investments, because there's too much obsession in South Africa with foreign direct investments. So it even becomes the priority of the ANC manifesto that the president is going to look for 1 trillion, as if that is going to deal with our developmental challenges. That is the obsession. And you know, when foreign direct investors come, they always try to tamper with your laws, like Total did with the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Amendment Bill, which had to be withdrawn for them to announce that they've made a discovery of oil and gas in Mossel Bay. Why? Because the amendment bill was saying that the state must be in ownership of at least 30% of that project. That was the amendment bill's proposal, passed by the National Assembly, passed by the National Council of Provinces, but not signed by a president because Total was still negotiating that bill must be pulled out. And we are saying we can have the state as custodian of all land, like the state currently in South Africa is a custodian of all mineral resources and all petroleum resources. What we need to guard and make sure that is handled properly is the redistribution processes, that it is not abused. We must put a legislative framework that deals with those issues. And I hear the fighter was speaking about the comrade was speaking about the banks there. You know, it defeats us. Like, we go to parliament, we realize because of the perennial incapacity of the ANC, we then put a Banks Amendment Bill which basically says that the Banks Act must be amended to permit for the state to create a bank, a state-owned bank. So a state-owned bank is not going to racially profile its client. It cannot do that. It's not going to give higher interest rates to black people. Like, it won't discriminate against people. It won't willy-nilly dispossess people of their houses, because it will understand that this in any way in the other aspect is going to become our burden. We put clear, straightforward Banks Amendment Bill, and the ANC didn't support that. And there are people who will say they are fully normal, who will wake up on the 8th of May and still vote for the ANC. I don't know what would have happened. So it's one of the issues that you have to deal with differently, because the same people who failed to deal with these issues are the same people who are in that list. The new additions is the more compromised from provinces. So the ones who were either fired as mayors or as MECs, they were just added that knowledge. You must go and do that at the national level. It's one of the issues that we're dealing with. We need to be firm on the land question, and we must be coherent. We must not allow space for opportunists like it has been happening now. It's a case of historical justice. We're at the correct moment now where there's beginning to be some consensus. Let us consolidate on it and make sure that we return the land to its rightful owners. Thank you very much.
Comrade Sali.
Yeah, I'll just say Floyd is really in the campaigning mood. You know? I'm not going to follow him. Safe to say, at the moment, there's no major differences in the country regarding the transformation and the question of the land, how to approach the question of the land across the board. So I think that's where we should start from. There's nothing like someone from Mars came with a special idea, now we are all interested in this new idea. There's general agreement and acceptance even by major parties in parliament, excluding the reactionary DA that has opposed this question on the expropriation of land without compensation for the historical interest. So we know that. So in that case, whatever Floyd was saying going forward was just to politic about electioneering and stuff. But there's a serious focus about this question of expropriation. I just want to make a point that I feel going forward regarding Section 25, I agree with that comment about the utilizing Section 25, even with its current limitations, because you need to test it. In fact, we've been arguing that let's test it. Let's go and expropriate a piece of land and test it so that when we respond by expropriation law, we are clear about what this expropriation deals with regarding the impediments that we encountered in the process of testing this expropriation clause. We have made that call. In fact, in our campaign on land, this was one of the demands. We're not only calling for the removal of the willing seller, willing buyer policy. We're actually calling for the testing of the Section 25, which unfortunately has never happened. But the bigger issue, and I was raising with Comrade Floyd that This is an issue that we need to discuss going forward. And I'm glad that he has expanded other areas regarding distribution, because once expropriation is done by policy or by legislation, you now need to focus on distribution. So it's an area that, it's a new debate, it's a major area that will come up for engagement. The question on expropriation is that what we also need, it's a policy on expropriation, not just on land, but on broad property and other fundamental questions of economy. For instance, water rights. Water in this country is not used properly. We went to Mute, for instance, when we were fighting for the people there to have access to water. They have a dam, they've got this massive water tank in their area. Water passes them to the farms because they don't have water right to that thing. So the law of expropriation must be a general law that deals with various sections of public interest. So land should be just one of them. It could expand to that. So that's an area going forward that we must finalize. Regarding this question on FDIs, first, the reality is that this is another communist ideology. We move from the concrete to the ideal. So the concrete reality is that we live in a capitalist society. We also accept that. We don't want it, but we accept we are in a capitalist society. In fact, not just the worst form of capitalist society is called free market economy. Where, for instance, this bottle of water that you are drinking, if you go to 5 different shops, you'll find 5 different prices of the same quantity in same area because of the notion of free market economy. That's the worst form of the capitalist system. We live in that. Under that condition, you do need foreign direct investment. And that's why, for instance, we think foreign direct investment is critical. Comrade Floyd, the EFF, I see the EFF posters on the street, they talk about jobs. Foreign direct investment will also bring jobs in the country. We have already our president has already raised in excess of 200 billion, as well as over 300 billion in commitments from foreign direct investors who will be investing their resources in this country. Those resources will be creating jobs. So we can't simply say, it's ideally, we would want our own economy to be self-reliant, independent, and in the main rely on public investment and local investment. So we do need foreign direct investment. But we must say, as we require this foreign direct investment, we must also appreciate the fact that when you bring foreign direct investment from capitalist countries, what they then do, they strengthen the system of capitalism and capitalist social relations. So that's the issue that we socialists must be dealing with. But at the moment, for the people of our country, majority of whom do not have jobs, they need this investment so that they can find jobs. So the issue is also that in those jobs, they must be in productive sections of the economy. So we must channel those investments. They should not just come here and go and put all the monies in the stock exchange as speculative money that can create jobs, the money that can be moved in and out of the country at the wink of an eye. So those are the issues that we must basically deal with. Otherwise, this foreign direct investment will come and deepen the system of capitalism. But otherwise, we accept that foreign direct investment, given the reality of our country, are needed. So these are the main question. I think the rest, Ubabu Malindi will deal with. Yeah.
Is this on? Yeah. Comrade Meluleki, you making me differ with Comrade Solima Paila here on whether expropriation must be tested by going ahead to expropriate immediately. I think the quicker route will be to pass the law on expropriation and have that tested because it will be challenged in courts. But if we go ahead now and expropriate tracts of land, we are sure to meet a challenge in the courts by AfriForum, the Helen Suzman Foundation, and 20 other amici curiae in that process. So what we need to do is to test our willingness to act on the basis of an ideological approach to the question of land. I think it was Comrade Tia who asked about Section 25(7). The problem with that, of course, is the 1913 cutoff point. By 2013, all of South Africa had been colonized by Britain and the Dutch, and so we had 4 colonies by 1910. Land had already been taken through colonization, so we must not limit ourselves to 1913 and subject ourselves again to endless processes of litigation in court instead of being sure about how land is owned and how land is will be distributed. And Comrade Floyd has spoken like a lawyer that let's pass legislation on the question of land rights and then pass legislation on setting up administrative bodies that will decide how land will be distributed and utilized. When we were in Parliament, we made an example that someone who wants to invest in forestry must decide whether they want to invest for 2 harvests or 3 or 1. We understand that for a tree to be harvested in those plantations, it's 25 years, that's your first harvest. So you take a lease for 25 years or for 50 years or for 75 years, not ownership of that land in perpetuity and having to sell it back to the state at great expense. We were asked in Parliament why expropriation without compensation, and I played that clip by Anton Rupert just to be silly. But in one of his answers at the end, when he was asked, in view of our history, do you think land reform and redistribution is possible? He said no, because the state can never ever be able to afford to buy back the land and redistribute it to the number of people who no longer have land. And that is the answer we gave, and we think that this is the answer that must underpin the question of whether expropriation of land is a legitimate form of redistribution or not. Comrade Deputy President asked about the fair process, utilizing a fair process to redress the consequences of an unfair dispossession of people of land, etc. We have become a constitutional state, and I think we must guard that at all costs. Comrade Krish advised us so on the first day of these proceedings here, that we have adopted constitutionalism, and it is through constitutionalism that we'll be able to address all these issues. And therefore, expropriation of land without compensation, constitutionally mandated, is a fair form of redressing an unfair situation that has prevailed since colonialism and under apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. That was the first round of questions. I wonder if, in terms of our terminology, we are not confusing ourselves. This came to me from a conversation that I had with a senior advocate in Mozambique. As NADEL, when we went to Parliament, we used the example of Mozambique, where there was a full policy of nationalization of land after Frelimo took over the state. And what they managed to do was increase their foreign direct investment, their GDP, and they're the strongest and most stable, not the strongest, they're the most stable currency in the world. So I wonder if we are not confusing our terminology when we address it and we say expropriation of land as opposed to the nationalization of land, because in effect, Comrade Floyd showed us the entire map of South Africa. That can't be expropriation without compensation. Surely that is nationalization of land that we are talking about. That's something for us to consider. I'm taking a second round of questions from the center row. Comrade Tia, I think you asked a question. Center, one question. Comrade JB? Hi.
A very short question. Comrade Floyd, I'm referring to the Joint Constitutional Review Committee. When you as parliamentarians crisscrossed the country, the perception that was created was as if it will be very soon to amend the Section 25 of the Constitution. So my just short question will be, as you will be rising as Parliament on the 20th, if I'm not mistaken, 20th of March, what are you going to tell people outside there when they ask, where is the land? Because as early as last year, during those public hearings, people were saying, we want land. And then there were also people who were having posters saying, no land, no votes. My short question is, how are you going to face those people, the barrage of questions that you will be faced with? Comrade Mapaila, just very shortly, you were saying, if I understood you correctly, after the expropriation of land without compensation, it should not be necessarily to say the land should be restored to the people who will be saying forced removals who were removed there and that place. Now, my question is, what are you saying about the number of people who lodged their claims, some of them before 31st December 1998, hoping that they will be restored the actual land from where they were evicted or dispossessed, and those who lodged their claims after the reopening, which was shelved through the Constitutional Court decision. Are those going to be, should they be abandoned? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade JB. Bloemfontein branch.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My question is directed to Floyd. I have detected an inherently contradiction between the pronouncements made by Floyd as opposed to somehow populist rhetoric by Julius Malema on the land question. He has been very vocal that people should occupy every piece of vacant land in the country. And it would seem that from EFF's perspective, land expropriation has already begun. Now, there is contradiction where, according to him, there is legislation or legislative process that is currently underway. Now, if the legislation process is underway and not yet concluded, But on the other hand, Julius Malema is encouraging people to occupy every piece of vacant land. Is that not a contradiction?
Thank you, Comrade Zio.
Thanks very much, Comrade. Just I want to pose two questions on the whole panel.
Sorry, Comrade, one question, please.
Okay,
We're
I'll
going
pose
to wrap
one.
up the session just now.
The challenge that I would want the panel to address on is that if you look in a South African land question, in as much as we want the land back, but we have to deal with certain realities. What the politicians would always argue are the unintended consequences. Now, if you look in our situation, almost 100 billion of bonds exist with the land bank, meaning that that land, people have bonds on that land. Now, the argument is expropriation without compensation. If you look at the commercial banks, just on farmland, on the report of 2017-2018, 49 billion existed in bonds over that land. Just looking at land bank and the commercial banks, just on agricultural land, you have 149 billion plus that is owed to those institutions. And if you look at the map that Comrade Floyd showed, it's expropriating the whole country. Meaning from that 149 billion, you also have to add all the bondholders in the country. Because if you expropriate that land, meaning that the banks no longer control that land in terms of bank to execute should you default in your payment. Now then, the unintended consequence would be, won't we end up collapsing our own financial system? And then we come back later and say those were the unintended consequences. How will we deal with that?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No, Comrade, sorry, Comrade Tia. I'm wrapping up. I want to take hands from this end of the room. Comrades, we need to wrap up. Our speakers need to leave also. The truth is we can spend a whole day on this topic and there won't be enough time. I wish I could take every single question from the floor, but I can't. I'm starting at the back of the room. Comrade, I recognize you. Comrade Nokukanya, here in the front, Comrade Zuko, and those are the last of the questions. Thank you. And Comrade Tia. Okay, the House has spoken. Sorry, Comrade Tia. I tried. So those are the last four questions.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Firstly, a comment. I just wish to state that it looks like the superior logic is being displayed here by the Deputy President of the EFF. But let me just ask a clarity question from him. There is an issue of expropriation of land. I just want to get from you, Deputy President of the EFF, whether would it not be proper for us to say that instead of expropriating land, we're saying we're returning the land to its own, to its own owners, instead of saying expropriation. Because I've got a problem. There's lots of people who think that expropriation means returning of their own piece of land, which was taken through a barrel of a gun from them. Now, don't you think that we should really reframe this particular issue to say returning of the land to its rightful owners? That is the question. And the last issue is to the Comrade Mapaila there. Comrade, you spoke about the issue of the fact that this thing of land should not be racialized. I'm a bit confused because land was taken by certain racial people. It was not taken but it was taken by settlers from black people. Now, when we say we should not racialize, what do you mean by that? Because this issue is actually a sensitive issue, and settlers took land from people, Saints, Khoisans, and blacks through.
Thank you, comrade.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So.
Comrade Nokukanya, one question, please, let's keep it short. We're running out of time, and I want to conclude the session.
I definitely have just one question. Thank you, Comrade DSG. The fundamental question is this. Can the panelists address us on how the process of expropriation of land without compensation will affect the patriarchal relationships that directly affect the use of the land and women's position in relationship to that land? Thank you.
Comrade Secretary Rafik Hendricks from the Western Cape. I'm a property law expert, conveyancer, and this topic is very dear to my heart. I was 7 years old when I was evicted out of District 6. So I'm a victim, I know what it is. Now the question is, when you build a house, do you build the foundation or you build the roof? 25 years since the dawn of our democracy, and Comrade Savambu, you were part of the ruling party. And this is also addressed to the alliance partner, so Comrade Solly, that when you want to move forward, we have to look back. I think that's a starting point. But the question I would ask, was there a proper land audit done of all South African land? Land amnesty, like we had the TRC, should have been called. Like I said, it was 25 years down the line. People got land by ill-gotten gains. When you go to the deeds office, you can see when the old deeds we pull up, the previous regime or people, owners of land, were in cahoots with the deeds office officials. And also the issue of land claims. My grandparents and my parents passed away. The government is still trying to figure out the solution to that problem of land claims. Now, obviously, coming back to the issue about expropriation, think about that question.
Thank you. I am keeping it short. Comrade Zuko, I'm keeping it short.
Thank you, DSG. Comrade Mapaila, please attend to that question about the racial issue, because really this issue was about race when it was taken. The statistic of 79% still in the private people, it's not black African majority, of course, it's in the other race, so attend to that one. But my question, Comrade Floyd, this issue of traditional leaders, I think it's an issue that within the side of the people who want this expropriation, there's going to be an opposition within. The reaction of the king from KwaZulu-Natal once there was that talk, how do you really are attending? Because the institution of traditional leadership, in its own nature, it is patriarchy, it has got those issues that deal negatively with women. How do you make them comfortable to be on board with this thing without fearing that you are going to tamper with their own institution and how they do things, so that they support, and what is your conversation with the king and how they responded, calling Amabuto and promising all sorts of things? I want you to address me on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Zuko. Comrades, thank you for the questions. This is the last round we're going to give our speakers to answer. Our SG is aware that after Parliament, we decided we're going to have a full day session on the land issue. I know she's attending to that. So there you will have another opportunity. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Do you know, like, the whole democratic dispensation inevitably had to tamper with the role and nature and form and content of traditional leadership. So you see, traditional leadership used to believe that they've got enforcement powers. And those were taken away in terms of enforcement of the rules of their areas, the areas that they oversaw. That is why we've got a king in prison now, because he was making enforcement according to the rules, which were applicable before the democratic dispensation. So there's no Amabuto who is going to disrupt the democratic discourse. Now, when we take a decision that the land is under the custodianship of the state, and this is the role which is going to be played by certain sections of society, including traditional leaders, there is no one who's going to disrupt that. They will be arrested. It's as simple as that. We live in a democratic state and we have to live with that reality. So there's no one who will disrupt that. And so there are issues which will deal with it. That is why we then say ourselves that let us set clear contours of within which laws and within which policies and processes should traditional leaders play a role in relationship to the land. And we emphasize that no sexism, no discrimination, no nepotism, no taking of bribes in order to give your cousins or friends a piece of land. And we must be emphatic and be clear about that. That is one issue that we must not tiptoe around in terms of what should happen. So that is basically the fact of the matter. In Ngonyama, the land that is in Ngonyama Trust belongs to the state. In Ngonyama Trust is an entity under the Department of Rural Development. So it's just because of political convenience now. The ANC will tiptoe around it and then they will say, no, let the king appoint everyone there. But the ministry can dissolve the Ngonyama Trust. That is why we could call the Ngonyama Trust Board to Parliament to say, just how are you handling your issues of allocation of land? How much money are you expending on this and that? If it was a wholly private entity, we couldn't have called it to Parliament to account them and raise concern about their own activities. So it's one of the issues that you have to deal with. Now, Section 74 of the Constitution outlines the process through which you should engage in to amend the Constitution. Particularly the Bill of Rights, like it specifies a process that there must be a Constitutional Review Committee, and then you must enact a Constitutional Review Bill. So you must have a bill which must be informed by the Constitutional Review Committee processes. So we put a motion in the National Assembly. It was passed, and then the NCOP passed the same motion, and then entered into the process of the Constitutional Review consultations. It was at the tail end of that process that we then established an ad hoc committee to enact a constitutional review bill which was going to effect the changes into the Constitution. And by the time we were doing that, the time had passed. There wasn't enough time because we did not want to make a mistake of rushing the constitutional amendment process because it was going to be subject to litigation unnecessarily by opposed groups who were at pains to try to find fault with each and everything that we're engaged in. So, AfriForum had a revolving group of people who will go to object to all the constitutional review processes across the more than 60 constitutional review meetings which we had with communities. So we had to handle it thorough in terms of what happened. The agreement in Parliament now is that the constitutional review process has been dealt with. When the 6th Parliament begins, we're then going to conclude the process of amending Section 25 of the Constitution to permit for expropriation of land without compensation. I would think that would be even a better environment to do so, because maybe the power relations would have shifted, not maybe, As a matter of fact, power relations would have shifted. And the ANC, because the ANC only listens when it reduces the numbers. Once we hit them on the polls, that is when they begin to listen properly. So we must do the 8 May thing, and then we then talk now. The land question, this is how it must be articulated. It will become even better because in the current framework, the ANC was going to live an extremely messy environment of an amended constitution and a limiting expropriation bill, which becomes a big problem in terms of what should happen. There is no contradiction between what the Commander-in-Chief says and what we say as the EFF. We say that there must be a process, a legislative process, a parliamentary process, but in the immediate, we must occupy the land. There's no contradiction about that. That is a resolution of the First National People's Assembly. That is the decision that we have taken. And by the way, like, if you have got time, there are so many new settlements now that have got people residing there with their own stands because of the land occupation struggles of the EFF. There is, and you must go to Atteridgeville, there's a place they call Jeffreysville. There is more than 2,600 stands, new stands of people there. And the only opposition could have come from the municipality, but because the municipality cannot just do as they wish without our approval, we said to the municipality that do not oppose the land occupation. Instead, you must go and redemarcate that place, make sure that there is water and electricity. The land occupation struggles are continuing. In any way, that is how black people got to settle almost everywhere in the so-called urban spaces. It is as a result of land occupation, which is an unapologetic program of the economic freedom fighters, which we pursue and is bearing fruits as we speak in terms of what should happen. I honestly think this thing about the numbers of the land bank and everything is just a scarecrow. It's insignificant issues. Like in the same way when we transferred the old order mining rights into new order mining rights, they were saying that no, there's going to be a crisis. Some even tried to go to court and challenge that. No, we have invested a lot of money in these mines. Anglo-American was saying that the mineral rights that were under our control are worth trillions. Are you saying we must just wipe out trillions worth of assets out of our books because now we are passing the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act, which says that we are no longer the owners of untouched minerals and petroleum resources. So we can transfer the custodianship of the land to the state. And the banks will have a relationship with whoever they've borrowed money about the top structure only. If it's the land, it's the loss. There has to be pain in some of the instances. It will have to be their loss. We cannot conduct a revolution when you think that certain people are not going to have something to lose. Revolution means that, by the way, that someone must lose something. You cannot think that, no, we must tiptoe. That is why Comrade Soli says, no, we must not be racial about it. You know, that is the Congress movement, non-racialism, which is not understood in clearer context, that we must tiptoe around white people. And comrades, you know, we've been in the Congress movement. Non-racialism in the ANC and the Communist Party means that you must be very careful of white people. That's what it means. It's about that the non-racial character is not about anything that, don't mention too much of black people, you know. That is the whole context of it. We are not confused as the EFF that we're in pursuit of the struggle for economic freedom, of land expropriation without compensation in order to restore the dignity of black people. There's no confusion about that. There's no, and that doesn't mean that white people must leave or white people are going to be excluded when we reallocate the land after expropriation or nationalization or reclamation of the land. It's terminology which you can utilize whichever way you want, as long as ultimately the land is back with the people. So you can use whichever word you want. Like you can use whichever word, reclamation in terms of what it should be. So that is the whole issue that must be understood. And you know, part of the things that should be emphasized, it is in the elections manifesto of the EFF. It says that when we redistribute the land, a minimum of 50% of that land must be received by females. That is what the EFF elections manifesto says, and that must be in the legislation. That at the ultimate end, when you redistribute the land, you must, because if you were to check the gender balance in terms of ownership of land currently, I think the Department of Rural Development did a land audit in 2010, and there's huge disparities. It's massive disparities to the extent that female ownership is less than 10% of the entire land surface of South Africa. And that has to change. It just requires decisive action. I don't understand the obsession with title deeds. So, you know, so the DA says, instead of taking the land, let us give the title deeds. I'm closing with this point. Let's give title deeds. And then they find you in your where you have been staying throughout and give you a small piece of paper, say, no, this is a title deed. And then you celebrate, no, I've got the land now. It's not like allocating new land. And then the ANC joins and says, no, the president of the ANC will be handing over title deeds, and then they go over to RDP, dilapidated houses, and say, no, handing over title deeds, the person has got a new title deed. But there is nothing that materially changes. And one thing which you're not thinking about is that when you take these title deeds and then distribute in the RDP houses, they are going to borrow money, 5,000 rand, and then back it with that RDP house. And then when they can't pay back that 5,000 rand, the bank is going to take that house easily. That is where it's leading to. So there's no wisdom in the whole obsession with title deeds now. Let us have a different land tenure system that is going to guarantee access to land by all our people. And that can only happen when we, all of us, realize that there has to be change of political power in South Africa, from a liberation movement to an economic emancipation movement, the EFF. Thank you very much.
Comrade Solly and then Comrade Pina.
Yeah, no. Amandla. No, yeah, he campaigns very, very hard. No, I think just 2 points. The first one is that there was an issue that I did not respond to earlier, which I think it's important to also respond to, regarding this, I think it's the FNB matter about differentiated credits between black and white. The SACP had launched a campaign in 2000, and we still run this campaign. It's called Transformation of the Financial Sector Campaign. And it has achieved many other big things, including the wiping out of credit records by those who were owing credit bureau. We exposed the credit bureaus. Like many other black people, we didn't know that the credit bureaus were too many. We thought there was one credit bureau until we entered into that space, leading this particular campaign. It's a matter that we've been dealing with for almost 2 decades now. This is the second decade since 2000. And it came with many other proposals, including the proposal for State Bank. It comes from this campaign of the SACP. The entire change of the financial architecture in South Africa. What is currently part of it is been legislated. We have been fighting for that. So I just felt that it's important to explain that, including, for instance, one of the major campaigns that we are embarking on in this section against evictions which are continued to be carried out by the banks. This is actually one of the biggest challenges facing black communities by the banks. And we've also engaged these banks and exposed them. In fact, the bank that leads with evictions is Nedbank. But of course, the banks that leads now, what we happen to know now, with discrimination in relation to credit granting, it's FNB. The method they use is that generally commercial banks had blacklisted African communities, the townships and everywhere else. If you're a professional, say in Thokoza, where I come from, an accountant, you want to establish an accounting firm, they won't give you loan because you come from Thokoza, and Thokoza is blacklisted because they characterize that everyone in Thokoza is notorious, therefore can't pay proper, can't pay the bank. And if they give you anything, their property is not guaranteed, because in terms of the legislation that governs them or the arrangement that they make, they create an impression that every other mortgage is owned by them, not you. So this is part of the financial sector transformation campaign program that we have led over the years. We hope you can join us in this particular campaign. It's a tough one. We actually even need lawyers. In fact, the guy that is leading our campaign on this one, Comrade Kinsibia, had represented Justice Mlambo, actually one day allowed him to address his court and actually borrowed him a jacket because he was representing the evicted people at the North Gauteng High Court on behalf of our campaign and Ilungelele Human Rights Foundation. And he's doing that free of charge. He's not an advocate. We actually had to sign some documents for him to be admitted, to have the right of appearance in court. So to continue this particular campaign, we'll also need some legal assistance going forward in this regard. The question about which I think it caused a confusion that I said the land question should, the racial question, that we should not racialize the land question. I was responding to the question of the non-racial project as a society. We have to be committed and remain committed to a non-racial South Africa. It doesn't mean you can't address the wrong things caused by racism. So there's a difference between addressing the land question and the injustices of the past, even caused by racial policies and colonialism, and a commitment to a non-racial future. That's what I'm talking about. And it's not tiptoeing to any white fellow or individual. We took up arms, I took up arms myself against white racists as a commitment, conscious commitment to fight against racism. Why would I go and actually pray a white man? There's nothing, it doesn't exist. The reality is that the historical injustice in this country was meted by a racialized system, a colonial system that later on characterized itself singularly as a racial system through the apartheid enactments. So to fight against that, you are fighting against racism. But fighting racism is not to fight against white people. There's a huge difference. That's the difference between the non-racial movement, the Congress movement. In fact, the thrust of the Congress movement's political theory is called the National Democratic Revolution. The National Democratic Revolution simply means a program of the movement headed by the ANC, which movement was supported by the general people of South Africa who came together to prepare the adoption of the Freedom Charter in Soweto. And that program seeks to resolve one or three interrelated contradictions or problems. The racial problem, that is to resolve the national question, to build a non-racial South Africa, and also address the problem caused by racism in South Africa. It also seeks to resolve the problem of gender inequality, to address patriarchy, for instance, the source of gender inequality in society, as well as to address power relations between men and women. So lastly, the major contradiction, the third main contradiction, is to address the class question, to create an egalitarian society, a society of equals. In that way, we have also indicated that you can't create a society of equals without removing the system that reproduces inequality, which is capitalism. That is why we in the Communist Party say the National Democratic Revolution is a direct route to socialism. That's the basis we are in relationship, in alliance with the African National Congress. If they were not having this commitment that we think laid the foundation for us to transit to socialism, we may not necessarily be working with them. So it's not tiptoeing at all to any racial bigotry or racism or white people. It's a commitment to accept that all human beings are the same, black and white. And that's the commitment our people gave in the Freedom Charter. So the issue regarding whether thank you very much, Comrade Chair. The issue regarding whether the restitution process, I was not saying we should give away restitution. We are committed to restitution. At the moment, still remain the framework, one of the 3 pillars of the framework of government policy, to return the land to those who were historically removed from a particular piece of land. What we're indicating is that in some instances, you find that, like recently there was a process here in Jimiston, in Dugatol, just not far from here. In Dugatol, for instance, the place where the African masses used to stay, it's now an industrial area. It's now a city. How do you take people back there? So the restitution was addressing those things. That's why within the restitution framework, there will be basis for financial compensation and many other things. People can consider a variety of things. And others, for instance, reject government's process of restitution. For instance, the Sorote family, Wale Sorote, for instance, in Alexandra, you remember when they built a road, they wanted to remove that road because there was no proper process of compensation, and the law allowed him and the family to refuse. The road had to divert across the road, across the house, because he said this is a historical house. Unless there's a proper form of compensation and how you want to preserve this house, we're not budging in as a family, and that was respected. So that framework is still accepted. We still fully support that as the SACP. The last point, I think, let me just also say this thing that we support. I come from a township, Togoza. I can tell you, I understand what it means to be born in a township and to be homeless. Many of my peers, my friends, when their families lost their houses, they became what we call hobos in the township. You go and find a shack or anything else, but otherwise you lose security of tenure. The distribution of title deeds was one form of guarantee of security of tenure. Nonetheless, I agree with Comrade Floyd that the obsession with the title deeds, particularly even in the rural areas, should not create a possibility where the black masses, given the levels of poverty, they then go and sell back the title deeds as guarantors to the banks. And finally, the banks, commercial banks come and take back the land on the basis that they were able to use this as a guarantor when they ask for loans from the banks. But the handing over title deeds is an important task of people's ownership to secure security of tenure or occupancy or ownership. That's what it's about. Otherwise, it's a hollow thing. So someone can just come and simply say, this is my land and so forth, and that can be allowed to happen. I must also say that, to join Floyd proper, the ANC remains the movement in this country with the most thoroughgoing transformation agenda that all other parties, including the EFF, they are short of reaching what they have in its transformation agenda. Is the party to vote for to continue this transformation agenda come May 8th. Thank you very much.
Comrade Nokanya, obviously there isn't time to address your question, which will require an extensive answer. But if land is nationalized and individuals approach the land commission or the state land allocation agency, which is independent. Obviously, people will be approaching that agency for allocation of use of land for the purposes that they want it, whether they are male or female, and therefore it will break the patterns of patriarchy that we have now. But of course, built into how that agency deals with the distribution of land, it will be a recognition that because of historical reasons, women have not been able to be the ones who we regard as being able to work the land. Just like it is said now that black people have no real claim to land because they don't know how to farm, they don't know how to use land, etc. So those forms of discrimination and those barriers will be broken down in that process. And about unintended consequences, comrades, every revolution starts afresh. We have to be aware of consequences, unintended consequences, but they must not be used to deter the question of nationalization or expropriation. In 1913, when the Nationalist Party allocated to white people 87% of the land and 13% to the majority, the consequences were looked at, and they made sure that white, especially Afrikaner people, had access to resources to be successful farmers, at the same time stripping black people of any ability to be able to work the land. And now we are told black people can't work the land. We must be aware of those unintended consequences, but every revolution starts afresh. As reciters of the manifesto will say, all of known human history to this day is a history of class struggle. So one class defeats another, it starts afresh. If we believe our revolution is true, let us stick to the principles and create a new society with a new economic order. And then lastly, I just want to say that in South Africa, we now want to outsource legislative functions to the judiciary a lot. We started with the question of the death sentence. Instead of passing legislation ourselves to say we abolish the death penalty, we outsourced it to the Constitutional Court. So we must not outsource the question of nationalization or expropriation of land without compensation. It's as legislative functions, political parties must do it, and those who are not happy, they believe it is unconstitutional, must go through proper processes of challenging it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers. It was indeed a much needed debate that we needed to participate in as NADEL. It was very intellectually stimulating. As we said, we promised there would be an Imbizo, a whole day's program on it. That is to come. You will be given the calendar. There are gifts for our presenters. Comrade Memory. Thank you very much to our presenters. We really appreciate your input today. Thank you very much. Comrades, we'll break for 5 minutes. We are so out of time. I extended the debate for very long. I tried to take every question. I do apologize for the questions I couldn't take. Hopefully in the future, you all will have that opportunity. Your break, you lost long ago. If it were up to me, I wouldn't give you a break, but 5 minutes.